Welcome to a show we're calling The World This Year. Yes, it's our look back at 2023, and with us is Patrick Smith, Editor-in-Chief of the Africa Report.
Greetings, Francois.
How's your year been?
I think, like most people, it's been a pretty traumatic year. I'm really happy to see the beginning of the new one.
All right, the promise of 2024. Are you feeling the promise of 2024? Lila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com.
I mean, we can only look up for the next year. It's been such a rough year.
That's a good, positive attitude. It can only get better. Will it only get better for Richard Verly, Paris correspondent for the Swiss publication?
Well, you know, as a Swiss, I always see the light at the end of the tunnel.
I see. Which you have plenty. Independent journalist Aïcha Goulsert, professor at the journalism department of the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. How are things?
God, what an introduction. After this, I can only be well.
Right. And 2024, will it be well for your students?
Well, we are still building the tunnel. You know, oops, that could be very badly interpreted. But you know what I mean.
All right. Make it your New Year's resolution to listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. Remember 2020? The COVID pandemic upended global supply chains. Politicians swore they'd never again outsource production of so many vital goods so far away. Well, as 2023 draws to a close, the U.S. has put together a naval task force. Here you see the French frigate Languedoc, which is part of it, to patrol commercial vessels in the Red Sea. This as Yemen's Houthi rebels target ships associated with Israel. Many, like oil giant BP, are rerouting their tankers. And as you can see on this map, Richard Verly, we're talking about global supply chain strains. The price of oil has been rising steadily in the last week. What happened with that promise of 2020?
Well, it happened that Mr. Putin, the Hamas, decided otherwise. They didn't want to have, let's say, peace continue and be established. One point that is interesting on the map that you just showed is there is the problem in the Hormuz Strait, but there is also incoming election in Taiwan. So the commercial shipping lanes might be affected if there is tension on Taiwan as well. Presidential election is coming, so we should better watch Asia as well in the coming weeks. Yeah,
there's a lot to say about this map, Patrick Smith, because Taiwan, where they make all the microchips that are so vital. The Red Sea. I mean, we've been used to in the past the focusing on the Strait of Hormuz. That was used to be the obsession.
Right.
Now there's lots of places. What happened in 2023?
Lots of choke points, including Panama Canal as well. So I mean, world trade is really at a bit of a standstill. Do you remember the container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal? That was only stuck there for 7 or 8 days. Yeah. But it paralyzed shipping, international shipping, for a week. And they're saying that the Houthi attacks on shipping, any Israeli-linked shipping and other shipping, could paralyze freight services for several weeks. And that's going to have a huge knock-on effect way into the new year. So I think it is a really serious matter. I mean, ships are now going the pretty way around via the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, to get goods from Asia to Europe and to the eastern United States.
It's bad for business, and yet, Lila Jacinto, the world is a more fractious place, as Richard was saying.
It is a more fractious place. I'm afraid that it'll also get a bit more expensive because shipping companies are already slapping a surcharge. There will be a delay in deliveries. Now, the U.S. has put together a coalition for the Red Sea passage.
And there was already one to combat Somali pirates not far away.
Yep. Exactly. But the thing is, this is more tricky because, I mean, you're having a coalition, you're going to have command and control issues, rules of engagement issues. The Houthis are firing drones. The Western powers have fairly good missiles, but they're expensive. Almost €1 million for a missile battery. We're running low on stocks. And if there is any strike on Yemeni soil, would that be tantamount to declaring war on Yemen? So this is this operation is called Operation Prosperity Guardian, but it's a very tricky one to do, and we never expected the Houthis to be able to do this.
Right, that's the glass half empty. The nightmare scenario that you're describing, the glass half full, is that things quieten down eventually. Oil price rises have been modest. Much more worrying, Patrick Smith was mentioning it, shipping companies are really worried about the chronic drought plaguing the Panama Canal. It's a canal that's dependent on levees. Aisha Gulsert, we're talking about these man-made conflicts around the globe, but it's also been the hottest year on record with more extreme weather. It's ironic that the Panama Canal problem is even a bigger problem for global logistics.
And this year has also been the year where we have had crisis after crisis, whether it has to do with climate, whether it has to do with wars, with famine, with refugee issues. And still, there's also something I feel like it's new. There's an odd indifference. We've seen indifference. We've seen it a lot. This year, I've noticed it even more at the United Nations, in terms of, not only in terms of what's going on in Gaza, but also in terms of, even for Ukraine, it had to be pushed or pulled by the US for Europe to be able to move that much. And then also in Africa. I mean, what's going on in Sudan?
What is it, we have a shorter attention span?
I think it's like, if it's the whole mentality of, if it's far away from me, if I don't see it, it doesn't impact me, I'm not going to look that way.
Hasn't it always been the case, Leila Jacinto?
No. It hasn't. And I'm generally, at the end of the year, I'm not someone who gets excessively cynical. But at one point, I did ask myself, is this what it felt like when Rome was collapsing and the people in Rome were just going on as it is? Because it absolutely feels like this is a collapsing world order. We can talk about it. I mean, we still have a superpower which has military might and the economy, but it absolutely felt like the structures were crumbling and people in the West were just going on as life is normal, and my people who were not in the West were exploding. So this divide was very marked this year.
If you really want to get into the grim projections, a lot of people, some historians are drawing parallels between this year that's just gone, 23, with 1913, when...
This is a real happy Christmas
This is a happy Christmas projection for you all.
If you wanted happiness.
They point out the key parallel is then countries just they discounted the possibility of an overall crisis and a long-term devastating war. Europe had appeared to have been at peace for almost a century. They just discounted the risks. And I think that's a little where we came out of COVID. We discounted the risks of other bad stuff happening. So then Ukraine took everyone by surprise. And now we have the Gaza-Israel war, which has taken everyone by surprise. Nagorno-Karabakh has started up. People are talking about Morocco versus Algeria. You've got the devastating war in Sudan, which is now the worst war in the world.
Let's see maybe the good side, if I may, the good side of it. The good side of this maritime trade problem is that it shows again that we in the West, be it the United States or Europe, need to reindustrialize. We need to bring back industries on our continent. And that move has already started. Biden is doing it in the US because he wants to give something to the middle class. There is a lot of talk in Europe of doing it. In France, they have this electric battery factory. So I think it's very clear today that we can't rely anymore on global trade.
Okay.
We need to have back our factories.
We got a good counterexample to what you're saying this week. Global trade routes can seem fragile or they can seem resilient. French investigative news site Disclose this week revealing how the French sporting goods store Decathlon is back in Russia on the sly, rebranded as Desportes over there, property of the billionaire Muliez family that also owns supermarkets and the DIY chain Leroy Merlin. They're simply shipping items from garment shops in Bangladesh thanks to a shell company in Dubai and a subsidiary in Singapore.
Well, it's not because they are doing so that we should consider that as a model. Clearly, what they are trying to do is to keep their importance on the Russian market because they were the first. They were in pole position for the sports market in Russia. But what I'm saying is one way or another, global trade should not be seen as something we can rely on as much as we did before.
Right, but the example of this is when you're coming across business interests and how much cheaper it is to have produce made in Bangladesh, use a front company for a label that should be called
So you
Despot,
outsource
right?
far away.
It shouldn't be called Despot, it's just a despot operation.
No, but then we shouldn't even be surprised that people, especially young people that I see in my classes, don't have faith anymore. They don't have faith anymore in the media. They don't have faith in the politics. They don't have faith in the companies. And what happened, what you just showed with Decathlon is exactly that. It's how, where is the transparency? Where are we headed towards? And I think that this year we have really, what Patrick was saying, we have lost something that made us, in a way, humane. You know, it's each time I've been seeing the United Nations trying to pass on a bill, I've said, how did we become this?
Yeah, Patrick's been mentioning the element of surprise. 2001 had September 11th, 2023 had October 7th. Hamas-led militants catching Israel completely by surprise with a raid on its border community, hitting a music festival out of Gaza, with more than 1,200 killed on the Israeli side and dozens taken hostage. And revenge swift, a full blockade and the relentless pounding of the Gaza Strip, coupled with a ground invasion. It's as the year draws to a close, there's no end in sight, Leila.
There is absolutely no end in sight. I mean, you know, where does one start on it? One is what the Gaza crisis has exposed critically for me during the past 2 months is how many different media news organizations I had to go to get different angles of the story. You know, you know, I know exactly where to go to try to find out what is happening in Gaza. Where do I go to get the story about Israel's politics and Netanyahu's? You know, where do I go to get the hostage stories? Where do I go to have, you know, the spin, the UN diplomatic cycle? And that's not even what is happening on social media. And this story has
Will all that change? Will all that change when, and at some point it'll have to, the fighting stops? At that point, will it be different?
Well, everybody says the war has to end. Gaza wars have ended, but there is a real interest for Netanyahu for that war not to end. And Israel has been a country that has been unable to elect a prime minister 4 years, 4 elections, and Netanyahu is what they got. So let's not fool ourselves that Netanyahu is somehow the only one responsible. This is the only man a democratic country has managed to come up. So yes, it will get over, and then we'll be back to the same old...
It'll be back to the status quo.
Yes, but there's one thing that has changed. Even if the war ends, even if Netanyahu goes, is the trauma that's going to stay in the minds of the Israelis, but also of the Palestinians after this war ends. I think that these two camps, in a way, have never been this far apart. I mean, I've been having talks with Israeli journalists whom I've known for decades, and even in terms of intellectual exchange, we are unable to not put some ethos. So imagine the people who are on the ground. So even if we are talking about a two-state solution, about, you know, we can live next to each other, I think that with the generations to come after this, it has never been this distant.
And just one quick thing that happened with this iteration of an old conflict is just the lack of U.S. credibility in its involvement in trying to resolve this. I mean, you know,
well, Afghanistan already after Afghanistan, U.S. has,
this
you know,
is
after
true,
its
but
retrieval,
I mean, what did come up was any sort of humanitarian deal was done by Qatar, and we are kind of seeing the rise of these middle powers, much more regional powers that can somehow get us into the state of at least a humanitarian pause, because the U.S. credibility just gone on this.
Netanyahu's been around for a quarter century, Richard Valli, but...
I'm not too sure about that, because if Qatar is active on the scene, and I was in Qatar 3 weeks ago. Qatar is on the scene because it has some kind of trust from the US, and it has support from the US.
But it
And
was
it has
also
Hamas.
financing Hamas.
That's
Exactly.
true. That's true. But I mean, if
via
it plays,
Netanyahu.
if Qatar is able to play a role, it
Right.
is also because it has partly the US backing.
Which is what a good role should be, to have both sides.
Now, coming to the emotion you mentioned, one thing that struck me, I spent one day in your competitor channel, Al Jazeera. And when I was there, it was the day when one journalist in Gaza of Al Jazeera lost 22 members of his family. And the guy was just talking with the host, with the François Picard of Al Jazeera. Everybody was crying. And it was just, I was really moved. It was not an information news channel anymore. It was a channel under bombing. The whole crew was crying. And that type of emotion is diffusing in the whole global south, as we say, because those are the people who watch Al Jazeera.
The year began with the promise that with growing NATO help, Ukraine would reconquer what the Russians took. But Moscow proved its willingness to dig in for a long war of attrition, capturing the eastern industrial town of Bakhmut after a hard slog at the expense of thousands of casualties. And now it's winter again, and the front line has barely budged. We've seen that the Ukrainians were trying to press in three directions, but the Russians are also advancing near Bakhmut on Advika. So we've been spun a tale that 2023 would be like 2022. It was not, Patrick Smith.
No, whatever Jake Sullivan, President Biden's security advisor, is saying, the conflict to most external informed advisors looks stalemated. That is to say, Ukraine's vaunted offensive didn't achieve what it had wanted to achieve, but Russia's vaunted counter-offensive after its first offensive didn't achieve either. So they seem to be locked in this. But the numbers favor Russia, the numbers in terms of the personnel and the numbers in favor of industrial military capacity.
Yeah, the year concluding with Vladimir Putin throwing a variant on that familiar theme, move your border away from our troops.
The events of the current year confirmed, and we all observe it, the West continues to wage a hybrid war against Russia. It actively supplies Ukraine with intelligence in real time, sends military advisors, and provides modern weaponry systems.
But Putin didn't always seem so sure-handed. The big boss had his moment of doubt back in June when Yevgeny Prigozhin's irregulars mutinied. The aborted march on Moscow by Wagner forces followed exactly 2 months later by the mysterious downing of the private plane carrying Prigozhin and his number two from the Russian capital shortly after takeoff en route to St. Petersburg. And it's funny because the year concludes, Aishikul Sert, with this feeling that, okay, if it's a stalemate, Putin's the winner for the reasons Patrick just mentioned. He seems like he's got it all under control. But if we were talking on June 27th, it would not at all have seemed like that.
Exactly. But also, I think Putin is one of those rare people, world leaders, who is really waiting eagerly 2024. He's really eagerly waiting to see if Trump is going to pass. He's going to have his round two at the White House. He's waiting to see what's going to happen at the EU elections in June, whether his, good friends like Orban, Meloni, even if she doesn't want to say...
No, Meloni is not a good friend of Putin.
Okay, first of all, Switzerland, let me finish.
It's very good.
Yes, but they're not far in terms of politics. They're not good buddies as much, but they're not far. I'm talking about far right. See, when you wait for me to finish the sentence, you get it. And also for people like Orban. So he's waiting. Prigozhin could have been one of the men to look up to for 2024. He could have been the man of 2023, but of course, Putin had other plans for him.
Yeah.
2023 was the year of Putin. I couldn't help notice that the Hamas attack was on his birthday.
Right.
And October 7th. And, that Gaza, the war in Gaza, has increased Putin's standing with the global South. That is emerging as middle powers.
Putin organized to have his birthday on the 50th anniversary of Yom Kippur War as well. I think there were other concerns on the the calendar as well for Hamas myself. But
Yeah, last week, by the way, we got news of a rebranding. Gone that favorite of Nazi opera lovers, Wagner, in the same Africa Corps. The Africa Corps. It's the same name as Hitler's battalions that fought in North Africa during World War II. Richard Verly, what is it about the names of these mercenary groups in Russia?
Well, Putin has to rebrand Wagner, not only because he wants to show that things are moving on, but because he wants to cut it clearly between the former leadership on Wagner and the present soldiers of Wagner. The foot soldiers, he's going to change them as well. He's going to recruit new people. So Africa Corps, I don't know whether this name will stay. What is interesting in this name is that it has the word Africa. And clearly, that means they are the Russians. They are here. I don't know what Patrick is thinking about it, but they are here to stay. They have long-term plans. They are not going to withdraw.
And perhaps a first destination for the Africa Corps might be Niger. This Friday happened to mark the departure of the last French troops, or at least the announcement of it, 1,500 of them. They'd been fighting jihadists the past decade. Their departure precipitated by that fallout with coup leaders, contrary to neighboring Mali and Burkina Faso. The French also closing their embassy in Niamey for the time being, Patrick.
well, right across the Sahel now. That's Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger.
French embassies remain open there, by the way, in those places.
But the troops have left.
Right.
Yeah. So the security blanket, both from the French and from the European Union, and of course the UN as well, is out.
And are the Russians in? Are the Russians
Well, the
in?
Russians are not in, by all accounts, fully into Niger, but they're extremely friendly relations. The weird thing about Niger is that the Americans are still continuing with their drones base, $100 million drone base in Agadez. The other point about Agadez is that it's a key transit point for migrants going from the coastal towns through Niger, across the Sahara to the southern shores of the Mediterranean. And the junta in Niamey has told the EU, well, we're no longer going to play your game. We're no longer going to cooperate. So from now on, you sort out yourselves.
You think the U.S. might stay?
The U.S. is, for now, the U.S. is keeping that drones base going because it certainly isn't going to want to leave it to the successors to Prigozhin in the Africa Corps.
But does it mean they will have to work somewhat with the Africa Corps, or what type of interaction?
No one's at all clear. I mean, since the coup, the Americans sort of held fire on their policy. They said, well, it's really regrettable, but they didn't go all the way with the EU in saying that the junta has to hand back to the civilians immediately. They took a longer-term view. So I think they're looking for a way to continue operations. It's an intelligence center for the entire Sahel.
The Wagner effect, by the way, also felt in Sudan, where in the fight that erupted between rival generals back in April, Russia and Wagner sided with Hemeti, the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, against General al-Burhan, whose main backer is Egypt. Their personal feuds now displaced 7 million civilians, Lila Jacinto.
One of the overlooked stories of the year 2023. These two generals, these two warring generals, have reduced this country to absolute penury, but they've got backers. And the RSF boss, Hemeti, has made plenty of money, and which is why we are seeing an offensive. He's got the backing, he's got the arms, but I mean, what we are seeing in the Sahel, which you didn't mention this year, is France out. France out of its precaré, on the east side, looking very unstable. So sort of an abandonment of Africa happening.
I feel like 2023, sorry, Patrick, I interrupted you, but 2023, the key question is whether it's in Africa, in the Middle East, is it genocide? And the question that's coming up in 2024 is, is the democracy in danger? And we keep changing, sometimes looking and not looking. I think in the US, what you were saying in terms of Africa is playing what the US has always played as a role, as it's in terms of it's here now, it can be gone tomorrow. So it's not an ally or an intelligence service that you can really actually have faith in.
Well, it almost certainly, just on the genocide issue, it almost certainly is genocide
Exactly.
in Sudan.
Absolutely.
And there are
Absolutely.
investigations ongoing into what the Rapid Support Forces are doing in the Darfur region, for certain. They're extending their control. Worth saying about the regional powers getting involved, that the United Arab Emirates has been serially accused of supplying arms and material to the RSF. Egypt, the same to the Sudan Armed Forces, the sort of the national army of Sudan. And Saudi Arabia, along with the US, has half-heartedly tried to negotiate some sort of ceasefire, but terribly unsuccessfully.
And this is unfortunately a déjà vu, because in Darfur 2 decades ago, it was exactly again this question.
It is, and hundreds of thousands of people are getting trapped in this conflict. And the US, by its own lights, is now saying that the war in Sudan is actually worse in humanitarian terms than either Ukraine or Gaza. And that's saying something.
All right, Richard Verly mentioning a possible other place that we'll have to look for in 2024, and that is Taiwan. There are elections there taking place January 13th. Fortunately, there's a slight easing of superpower tensions in the Pacific. The U.S. and China restoring military communications. It has been touch and go this year in disputed waters off Taiwan and the South China Sea. These are images from earlier this month. Chinese Coast Guard ships blasting water cannons at a small Philippines fisheries vessel, this off the Scarborough Shoal, and this again is over a maritime dispute. Richard Verly, is this going to get better or worse in 2024?
In the South China Sea, certainly not better. China is testing hard. They are testing the Philippines because at the moment with the new president, Marcos Jr., the son of former dictator Marcos, is switching back to the US, while Duterte, his predecessor, was clearly pro-China. So China is testing, China is putting pressure, and it will continue to do so. Recently, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, was in Vietnam. You know, relationship between China and Vietnam have always been very bumpy, very difficult. They even fought a war, but now China is trying to appease Vietnam. I think the key for China, they're trying to encircle Taiwan through Southeast Asia and by dominating all Southeast Asian countries. But I think it's not over yet, because a lot of these Southeast Asian countries, take it Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, they are looking towards the US because they know their trade main partners are in the West, not in China.
How big a deal do you think the elections in Taiwan are? I mean, if the Kuomintang come back to power,
well, if Kuomintang comes back to power,
will they try and cut a deal with Beijing?
Well, if Kuomintang come back to power, it's clearly a good deal for Beijing, and Beijing will try to get probably a kind of compromise, or will give leeway to Kuomintang to show its goodwill. But I have not seen the recent polls.
It doesn't look very likely, though.
My understanding is at the moment Taiwan and Taiwan people are still willing to face China, which I think is a proof of courage, democratically speaking. And I think we should look at it as a democratic victory, though it brings tension in our trade and in our world.
All right. Earlier we were speaking about what's going on the African continent. It's not just coups and civil wars. There have also been elections. They're counting ballots in the world's most populous Francophone nation, the Democratic Republic of Congo. The electoral process has been less than perfect. These images shot by our team in Kinshasa, where some people waited 6 hours to go vote on Wednesday. The vote was extended to Thursday, in some parts even until Friday. It's been how should we say it, Patrick Smith, a colorful process so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think $1.2 billion this process has cost the country so far, when conditions are far from ideal on the social and...
It was damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you stuck to the rules, then there would have been no voting on Thursday or Friday. If you extend it, then that raises suspicions. Did they do the right thing by extending it?
I think they had to, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were not ready on Wednesday morning. No question, people were getting up to vote at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they were still waiting there 7 hours later for their ballot slips. So, no, I mean, they had to extend. There are some worrying things. I mean, Dennis Kadima has got a good reputation as the electoral chief, but some of his lieutenants are clearly aligned with President Tshisekedi and his party. So, I mean, there's some worries about that. The fact that a lot of the independent observers have not either bothered to turn up or have been, have had rows with the government and have left, like European Union observers were not allowed to use satellite phones, which are pretty useful in a country the size of Western Europe with sort of poor comms. So, I mean, a lot of questions already before we even get to the results. And I think a lot of people think that it's more or less a foregone conclusion that Tshisekedi is going to be announced the winner.
Be announced the winner.
Yeah.
But also, I think it was important. I mean, I'm not an expert on Africa as much as Patrick, of course, but to have about 44 million to go vote, to show them, especially in the history of Africa, to show that, yes, see, it comes back to the whole thing of having trust, having faith in the system. Can the system work? Can democracy be a part of Africa, since it is a part of the dynamism? It is important, but also even the fact that there was a candidate like Denis Mukwege.
Yeah.
It was, I think, you were talking about the hopeful, to show that this man who for 20, 30 years has repaired women in a way, who won the Nobel, to show that he can bring something else to Africa, to a country like Congo.
There were no shortage of brilliant candidates.
Absolutely.
I mean, Martin Fayulu, who actually won in the last elections in 2018, as the digital record showed, he is a really impressive, not as a humanitarian like Mukwege, but he's a corporate guy. He's got a great reputation. And the other thing we should say on the positive side on Congo is 100,000 candidates at local government level and provincial government level. So maybe, in a way, those elections will prove more important in changing people's lives, because there are clearly a lot of extremely ambitious and talented people within the system wanting to play their role and try and sort of reconstruct the country
and serve as an example, and serve as an example for other African countries. Where there are so many coups and already despair to say that we want that right as well. Maybe not this year, but next year. It's
right. But there are other countries as well where right now you have had elections. The most populous nation in Africa this year, Nigeria, staged an election. Again, it wasn't a perfect vote by any means. And then there's Liberia, where an incumbent lost a very tight election and conceded defeat. We're talking about George Weah, the former football star. Were you surprised, Patrick Smith, that he conceded gracefully? It was a tight vote.
I think it was absolutely great that he did, and that's what comes of winning the Ballon d'Or. I guess you have a sort of reputation to sort of do the right thing at the right time. You've got a great sense of timing, and he had his detractors. I mean, some of our mutual friends who are Liberians were saying we're really worried about what's going to happen if Weah loses this election by a small margin. He lost by less than 2%. But he was extremely quick to concede, phoned up Boakai, the victor of the election, within hours. It was exemplary. And it was a great surprise to the sort of the naysayers that Weah did this. And it seems to be, he seems to be prepared to hand over. And, the country will open a new chapter. So in the end, I think it worked out very well. It's great to see that happen in Liberia, which has had its own share of trauma in the past. Yeah.
Now one question is how we in the West particularly, but that can be true for other countries, but how do we deal with this? Because normally we should reward those democratic countries. I mean, countries where democratic change take place. So we should reward Liberia with more aid than other countries, for example. But it's not going to happen this way.
No, and maybe it's a good thing, because at the end of the day, the people who are going to reward, are the people that did it. And those are the Liberians and the people who made it possible.
True.
And, their reward is going to be building a stronger society with stronger institutions. And I have to say, I mean, talking about the West's demeanor in the world, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Nagorno-Karabakh, whether it's Sudan, West's credibility in the world as a promoter of democracy, human rights and justice is pretty abysmal at the moment. You travel around the world, I'm sure we've been to some of the same places.
True.
And, you get in conversations and say, I don't want to hear about Western values anymore. What the hell are Western values today? when, it looks like Western interests, not Western values. So I think the days of the West rewarding or punishing people in a meaningful way are kind of are changing, to be honest.
And that's what I was saying at the beginning. The elections that are going to happen on June 9th in the EU is going to show actually where it stands for itself in terms of democracy. It's not about promoting, as the Western countries, the democracy and freedom abroad on other continents and soils, but we're going to see if those 27 countries, how good they're going to do at the elections.
All right, and that we'll also see, of course, what happens the first Tuesday in November in the United States. We talked about the wrath of Mother Nature when it came to global warming. It was also natural disasters in 2023. Turkey, biggest earthquake since 1939, 7.8 on the Richter scale, followed by other tremors hitting the south and center of the country, as well as northwest Syria. The disaster so vast that for days, locals had to organize their own rescue efforts. More than a week later, our team witnessed the rescue of a little girl in the city of Antakya.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد. تمام هادي ما تبكي يا ربي
Tertemiz hiçbir şey dokunmamış ona.
toz bile dokunmamış.
Çok şükür yarabbim, çok şükür yarabbim, çok şükür,
At that point, when Julie Dungelov and Nadia Masi were filming, the parents were still under the rubble. That was her aunt you just heard there, Ayşegül Sert.
I was in Turkey on the second week in the region. I actually went and stayed for about another week. So the second full week I was there. What we see today in terms of 10 months after the earthquake is not really better. I can tell you that the official numbers of people who have died, the government says 50,000 people. When I've spoken with the experts and with the people on site, I think it's going to be times 3, so around 150,000 people. All the promises that were given in terms of Erdogan and his government saying within a year, all this devastation will be gone. We will build safer homes and buildings have not been done so. People are still have no water to drink. They're still living in makeshift tents, and this is 10 months on. So what we see today in Turkey, not only with these images, is actually people who have not even been able to find the bodies of the people they have lost 10 months later. So what we see today is that we had elections in May, where I was in Turkey. We have municipal elections coming in March as well. And that there are promises, not only from the government right now, but also from the opposition that are being promised, said, but the people who have lost so much have not seen one thing really get concretized. Plus, there's a lot of things that needs to be done. This is not only because of one government's thing. In terms, they say that if today there's another earthquake like this in Istanbul, Istanbul will be a no man's land. And yet, 10 months later, years later, because this is what the experts have been saying, nothing truly has been done.
Before Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power, there was a big earthquake in the north in 1999, and people were saying when this earthquake happened, this could be Erdogan's swan song, what just happened, because, and yet he got reelected.
Yes, he did. In a test case, in your perfect model for this illiberal democracy or democratic autocracy, or call it what you want. A couple of things. One is how unfair they were. They were free, but completely unfair. So there was no vote rigging, etc. But Erdogan's biggest competitors, Demirtas, the Kurdish Obama, do you remember him? He has been behind bars. We've forgotten about him. The opposition, the secular candidate that was a huge rival, İmamoğlu, Istanbul's mayor, could not run because of legal harassment. That said, and so we had the main opposition party put out an aging, uncharismatic candidate who ran on an onion, basically. You know, we're talking about the economic crisis, but failed to. And this is another lesson that, because I was in Turkey too when this happened. I think we sometimes fail to get how important the narrative is. The narrative meaning the cultural narrative, the narrative which is, it's not just about the dollar, stupid, which happens in the West. For a lot of people, it's the narrative that Erdogan provides about, you know, our time has come in a country that has never really been able to live with the other, whether it's the Kurds, whether it's when the army was in power, it was, you know, the Islamists and the veil. So Turkey has never really managed to have an inclusive thing. And Erdogan's sell of, you know, our time has come, and I'm going to go with him, also appeals to his base. So it was you know, when I was in Ankara, I was in Diyarbakir, the people who were against Erdogan were just saying, like, you know, this is the end of hope for us, because they really rallied for this election.
It's time now for our pick of the panel. This year is what you thought were the most overlooked stories of 2023. Leila, let's begin with you. And you took a look at something that we haven't talked about, which is, I guess you could say, the after effects of the Taliban returning to power in Afghanistan.
Yes, this year, Pakistan suddenly, very abruptly, announced that all Afghans without papers had to return to Afghanistan. Now, Pakistan has been, you know, host to Afghans for 3 decades now. That's one. And the reason why I picked it up was, you know, for 20 years, Afghanistan was in the news. And the narrative for 20 years, the media consistently overlooked all the gains that Afghan people were making. We just drove home this narrative that the US-led military operation was a failure. Then the Taliban comes. It's a lot worse now, and we have simply moved on. The US has repeated its engage in Afghanistan, leave Afghans to their fate. And some of the people, Afghans without papers who were left to their fate, were actually in Pakistan without papers because they were waiting for relocation to the US and the UK, and we're talking about Afghans who worked with the US military and US and UK-led
in grave danger if they return.
So, I mean, this is really, you know, a statement for me of what we've been talking about, you know, the lack of credibility of the West, the way the West moves on.
All right. Remember, to update on Afghanistan and Pakistan, remember the Panama Papers? That scandal that exposed how the high and mighty hide their money in warm places far from the taxman. Patrick Smith, you've got a very 2023 update on that story.
That's right. It's a slightly geeky story, so, you know, forgive me if we get into talk about tax havens and illicit financial flows.
We like it in Switzerland.
You like geekiness in Switzerland, yeah. Great, capital of geeks. Yeah, so what happened at the UN General Assembly was there was a vote and on a resolution led by Nigeria, which knows a lot about illicit financial flows and capital flight. And it was in favor of the UN establishing an international convention to set the tax rules for the so-called tax havens, the illicit financial flows and capital flight. And they went head-to-head with the European Union and the big Western powers and the US, who form the OECD around the corner here in Paris, actually, in rather nice buildings in the 16e arrondissement. And the OECD had opposed this move, but they lost the vote. Nigeria got 125 votes in the UN General Assembly to about, I think, 43 supporting the European view that it should the control of the tax rules should stay with the OECD. So what this means is the UN is going to set up its own convention and go through the difficult, you know, procedure of trying to get global buy-in to rules to stop capital flight.
Not just in the hands of the West, kind of what we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
For Richard Verly, it's not an overlooked story, but perhaps an overlooked man. For half a century in Washington, rivals and allies have underestimated Joe Biden. Yet today, he's president of the United States. At 81, he'll be running for re-election in 2024. Here he is agreeing with a ruling that bars Donald Trump from running in Colorado's Republican primary, this while on a stop to swing state Wisconsin.
You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, I'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero. And he seems to be doubling down on about everything.
All right, he certainly supported the insurrection. Richard Verly, what is it about Joe Biden?
Well, what has been overlooked, I believe, is the way he presides over the United States. Because we talk about Joe Biden related to Ukraine, Putin, China, Gaza. But what I'm interested in is he is a president who let his ministers, his Secretary of States, his advisor to work. Like, for example, the CIA chief Burns was in the Middle East. So Joe Biden is a guy who trusts his entourage. And to me, that is the story that we tend to overlook.
And perhaps
the
he
guy
will be...
brings trust in the system.
So he might be underestimated. Maybe he
and
will
he's
win.
the anti-Trump in that regard, not only politically, but the way he behaves, the way he presides,
Right.
he's completely anti-Trump. So we should get a good look at that.
Aisha Gulsard, your most overlooked story of 2023 is, I guess you could say, something of a fairy tale.
It is. It's so me. No, it's this year there was in Cleveland in the U.S. in a school. There was a book that was brought to attention that was never published. It was poetry by Langston Hughes, who is one of my favorite poets, who saw the last, the first years of the post-segregation U.S. and of another African-American painter, Elmer Brown, who actually had over three dozen poems and drawings that were supposed to be a book, and it never got to be a book. And this year, there was an exhibition in Cleveland in a school where these pages were brought together by students, and one day, maybe thanks to them, there will be a Langston Hughes new poetry book with Elmer Brown's drawings that and the name is...
That could even be a children's story.
Exactly, but it tells, as all good children's story, it tells something about us adults too.
What happens to a dream deferred, we'll find out in 2024. Many thanks, Aisha Gulsard. I want to thank Richard Verly, Leila Jacinto, Patrick Smith. Thank you for being with us here, and thanks for being with us throughout the year. France 24.
I'm Dave Keating.